Welcome back, friends. There is a river that runs its course through the center of our body, and that river is called the river of bliss. And yet, why is it that we are so thirsty? The Gita tells us why and how we can quench our thirst. Today's verse is taken from this is the book Essence of the Bhagawad Gita, commentaries by Paramahansa Yoganandaji as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. Today's verse is taken from chapter 2, The Nature of Right Action, verse 60. O son of Kunti, Arjuna, even the wise man, devoted to self control, may sometimes be swept away by the turbulent senses. Even the wise man, devoted to self control, may sometimes be swept away by the turbulent senses. This is an important warning that Krishna gives Arjuna here. And note the use of the words. He says, the wise man devoted to self control, that it's not enough to be wise. And Yogananda ji said that until we reach Nirvikalpa Samadhi, we are not free, we are not safe. So while we grow in wisdom through our experiences, through divine grace and understanding, we need to keep steadfast on the path, and especially steadfast in attunement to one that has attained freedom. Because the warning here is in a sense ominous. He says the wise man devoted to self-control, that even that unconditional surrender of our desires, our seeming understanding that we have, that I have surrendered unconditionally myself to God, and I'm practicing all these austerities of self-control, and this is leading me to freedom. I am free in my heart, that it can still be the voice of delusion that I am free, and while in truth we may not really be free. And that is a staggering thought, and must exhort us, must inwardly remind us again and again not to forget that until we are completely in God, that we must not delude ourselves with the understanding that I know. And he also goes on to say, going back to the verse, yes, even the one that is devoted to self control may sometimes be swept away by the turbulent senses. Each verse in the Gita is a prescription, which, if we can apply and partake of in our daily life, we move closer towards freedom. We move closer towards our higher self, our deepest realization in God, our deepest existence in God. It is interesting that to consider what is the turbulence of the senses. We know that Yogananda ji has stated in his teachings that God's energy, cosmic energy, is always entering our body through the medulla oblongata. And he says the electricity of God enters the body, flows into the nervous system, and out of the body. Through the searchlights of the senses, we begin to perceive the world for what it is. And when this energy keeps flowing down and out, and if we don't pause to turn that energy, to reverse that flow of energy inward and upward, up the spine, if we don't take this pause again and again, even as the energy flows outward and down, we begin to lose sight of our native home, which is in spirit. And as we begin to lose our remembrance of where we come from and who we are, we begin to take the testimony of the senses as the reality, as the truth. And that is why it's interesting, Patanjali called meditation, the act of meditation, as remembrance, as smriti, that there is nothing to be learned or unlearned. We simply need to, by undoing our conditioned thoughts and actions, we need to simply remind ourselves of who we are and where we come from. So it's very important as we engage in this world to turn that searchlight of the senses, as Yoganandaji would call it. He would say, turn those searchlights inside within you, and you will find a new world. Now, why? Let's consider what is the turbulence of the senses. Energy flows out through the body. We start perceiving the world through the eyes, through the ears, through the other senses. And as we know, this perception is limited. And as it continues to flow outward, our sense of awareness, our sense of expansive awareness begins to diminish until it becomes completely limited to the individual body or the form that we have taken. And so we begin to think of everything in terms of this individual body, of this individual self, the little self. And so we begin thinking, what's good for me? What's in it for me? How do I do this? We completely forget the power, the grace of a greater intelligence in God that is necessary to steer this chariot of the senses. It's a very beautiful picture, of the Bhagavad Gita, often that is shown Krishna driving the chariot and steering the chariot, and the horses representing the senses of man. That if we don't have the divine charioting us, our senses can take us into 100,000 million different directions. And that is why we roam for incarnations. As Yoganandaji would say, souls that have been cast out during the day of Brahma are still roaming at the night of Brahma. That's a staggering amount of time that the soul roams. But the fact is, we have free will. And this free will is such a sacred gift that if we don't use it in the right way, it can also become a curse, which continues to take us away from God with each thought, with each action. So, one expression of the turbulence of the senses is through emotional disturbances, that you begin to refer everything back to I, to myself. And so, when anything thoughts, that expectation we have towards I, towards myself, we become angry, or we become greedy, we become attached. So when we can learn to control the feeling of our heart, when we can lift this energy of the heart up to this point between the eyebrows, the energy begins to become refined and moves in the towards the quality of peace, of calmness, of divine love. But it is important for us to control that energy of the heart. Otherwise, emotional turbulences, another turbulence of the senses, that ultimately we see it result as outward circumstances. You will see it in the form of outward circumstances, karma, that one thought or one action that is not in harmony with the will of God, because the ego has now come in the way, because our perception of who we are has changed, and we think that I am responsible for my life, I am the doer. And so, keeping God out of the picture, what happens is we also become responsible, and we move away from God because we don't have any more perspective of the divine intelligence that is behind us, and we create karma. One wrong thought, one wrong action creates a string of errors and results in karmic disturbances that lead us into incarnation after incarnation. So, these are some of the ways in which our senses delude us of the true reality, of the true potential, the soul potential. And in the process, and there's a silent inner turbulence that often is very masked, the inner turbulence of the soul that has been denied its glory in God, of the tears of the soul in being ignored its divine will. That's a turbulence that is often that we often come to realize it towards the close of towards many incarnations. Yogananda ji said, in fact, Kriya being a very high path, a very high technique towards self-realization. He said, often you already have had to come a long way before you're given the gift of Kriya Yoga. So often for us, even to recognize or become aware of the turbulence of the soul, even through a single thought or a single action, takes us incarnations. But when we come to that point of anguishing monotony, one of those expressions of the inner turbulence of the soul, but when we come to that point of anguishing monotony, that's when our awareness is helped by the power of divine grace to recognize that there is something more, that the happiness that I have been seeking through so many outward objects, things, places, circumstances, and that never gave me any fulfillment or happiness that I was seeking, that still eludes me. And you begin to wonder, to ponder, to explore, to become a little more adventurous towards our eternal quest in happiness. Yogananda ji would more adventurous. Let us think, why is it that when we close our eyes, this world that we think is substantial disappears? And we experience it so often. Every day in sleep, we experience that we experience a different world. You may have you may have had a troublesome day, you may have lost somebody, you may have lost you may have lost a job. It must have been a traumatic incidents in your life. However, when you go to sleep, we don't remember any of that. And that is, Yogananda ji would say, that is a symbolism that this world is not real, that these suffer the what we call the suffering, the pains of this world are illusory, and they are given supposed potency and power by our imagination, by our identification, by our self identification with something outside of us. And that is what we want to break through the practice of self control. But what Krishna is warning us here about is, be humble in that search. Be humble as we walk this path towards freedom. In fact, there are many examples in in the annals of spirituality that validates this verse in the Gita. One very popular story is that of Sadhu Haridas, a very well-known, powerful yogi of the 19th century in India. And there is the story of Sadhu Haridas. He was crossing a river in a boat, and there was a Christian missionary with him. And the missionary, of course, was trying to convert Haridas into becoming a Christian. And Haridas was like, what does Christianity have? Why should I follow Jesus Christ? And the missionary said, because Jesus Christ is powerful, he could perform miracles. And he looked at the water around him and said he could walk on water. And Sadhu Haridas looked at the water and said, so what? Even I can walk on water. And he got out of the boat and he walked on water. And so he would display his power, his miracles often. And one day, the king of the city where he lived in, a very great soul, he always felt that there was something wrong with Haridas, that he was misusing the power, the divine power that he had. And he said, I see something wrong in Sadhu Haridas. And it turned out to be true, because after some time Sadhu Haridas fell from grace. He then married, and but eventually the good news is that he realized his mistake. And the moment he realized his mistake, he went back to his disciples and said, I'm back, my beloved is calling me. And it is said he sat in the lotus posture and entered into samadhi. Now, as Master was recalling the story to his disciples about the perils of misusing divine powers that we may acquire, that we may attain as we walk this path towards freedom, towards liberation. One of the disciples asked Master, but Master said he was instantly liberated at that point. And this disciple asked Master, but Master, shouldn't he have been punished severely? No, I think Master said that after a few incarnations he attained God. And the disciple asked Master, but Master, shouldn't he have been punished more because he fell from high grace? And Master said, God is not a tyrant. The moment a devotee realizes his mistake and returns to God, he said, God is forgiving and welcomes his lost child. And and this is important for us to remember here. So even while this verse sounds a warning, let us remember the love of God above all, that love which is always forgiving, which is always calling to us through every breath that plays through this body. God is calling us home. God is reminding us of his love for us, and he does it very silently. And it is for the devotee to recognize, to become aware that the silent power flowing through us, through the breaths, through the energy in the body, is the light of God, is the power of God. Hong Saw, I am spirit. All that we need to do is keep practicing our spiritual practices. Kriya Yoga, Yoganandaji would say, through the practice of Kriya Yoga, he would say, turn the searchlights of your senses within and see that you are a child of God. And morning and evening, every day, let us practice Kriya Yoga. If some of you haven't, please let us know, and we'll be happy to connect you with teachers who will guide you through this path. But for us to remember that our spiritual practices, the paths of yoga, training our mind, our heart to see all things in creation as reflections of the divine, as reflections of that one light, that the separation that we see outwardly through the senses is but a delusion, that behind all these infinitely varied forms is the light of God, is that one light which connects us all together. And this is what we want to remind ourselves, that we are light, we are energy, we are children of God. There was a cesspool being built in the ashram at Mount Washington where Yoganandaji was staying. And one day he was just looking at this disciple who kept digging. He kept digging the whole day. And suddenly he realized, oh, I have dug a long, deep well. And Yoganandaji said, the path is often like that. Just keep at it. And suddenly you will realize I'm there. And so that's the miracle. That's the beauty of the path. But that also often is the most challenging thing for us, that we always want to analyze, dissect. It's the function, it's the function of the rational mind, that you do something and you constantly ask yourself, oh, is this working? There is a tendency to doubt, is this working, is this not working, am I doing it right? Know enough to make sure that you're doing the right thing, but let it not become a weakness of a dominating mind. So once we know we are on the right track, once we use our discriminating powers to know that yes, I feel, I feel I'm putting a right step in front of the other,
Friends, I think I
surrender
just lost
completely. And when
connection.
we do that,
Friends will
and
be
yes, so I'll close with this story because we are beyond our time. Swami Kriyananda was sitting with Paramans Yogananda as Master was working on this great scripture, the essence of the Bhagavad Gita. And Master was editing some of his writings, and Swamiji was waiting for Master to finish. And as he waited, he was gazing longingly, lovingly at Master, gratefully telling himself what a blessing it is to be the disciple of such a great Master. And Master, after he finished his editing, he called on Swamiji to help him stand up. And even as he was rising up, holding on to Swamiji's hand, he looks with joy, deep joy, into Swamiji's eyes and says, just a bulge of the ocean, reminding that we are all waves on that one ocean. And he was also reminding, he would have caught Swamiji's thought that what a blessing to be the disciple of a great master. And Yoganandaji would always refer, he would say, they all belong to God. God is the guru. And in also, he was reminding us that of humility, that we are all instruments, that we are all channels, that don't get carried away by the power, the seeming power of the ego. The ego is powerless. It can delude ourselves into thinking we are power. Simply be a humble channel for God and gurus, just a bulge of the ocean. Remember the ocean behind us, always. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. I would now request.